Hola! Welcome to Esoterica and Nonsense, a podcast where we discuss myths, legends, folk tales, fairy tales, supernatural phenomena, and religions from around the world. I am your host, Annabelle, a pepper pie sugar pie, and I am here excited, ready, juiced. First of all, I'm just so grateful that I have new listeners from all around the world. I got an email last week saying that I'm ranked 164th in the Netherlands in the spiritual sector for podcasting. So I'm pretty sure that means I have one listener in the Netherlands. But I'd like to shout out to you. Email in. You're an all-star. So, today we will be covering La Llarona. So, I actually got this request from a friend, and I've heard about La Llarona, but I had no idea the truth behind her story and the speculations about where it comes from. So, La Llarona is known as the weeping woman or the wailer. She comes from Hispanic America. She is a mythical, vengeful ghost who is said to roam the waterfront areas, mourning her children whom she drowned. So there are so many variations of the specifics of why she drowned her children, but the most common backstory is a tale of an indigenous woman who killed the children that she bore of a conquistador after he had abandoned her. Typically in this story, she is this beautiful woman. Her name is Maria. She marries a rich conquistador and they have 2 kids. And one day Maria sees her husband with another woman, and in a fit of blind rage, she drowns her children in a river, which she regrets immediately. And consumed by guilt, she drowns herself as well, but is unable to enter the afterlife and is forced to live in purgatory and roam the earth until she finds her children. Another very common version of this story is the kids were in fact illegitimate, and she kills the kids so the baby daddy cannot take them from her. Universally, she is described wearing a white dress, and it's often wet, and she is almost always described as having long dark hair, and she's known to wail during the night and is almost always near water. But, like I mentioned, there is a whole bunch of variation in the stories. So, for example, in Mexico specifically, it is thought that at this point her story is told often, mostly to keep children from not wandering off at night. It's like an incentive to scare children out of leaving the house or just wandering alone. And actually in Mexico, she is almost revered as like a piece of popular culture. So there's actually a famous artwork by Alejandro Colunga, and he has a painting of her marrying Chamuco, who is like this this devil demon character. And there's this really great painting. I highly recommend looking it up. There's also once a year in Mexico City, there's a theatrical performance at the waterfront known as La Cihuacoitl, and it is dedicated to the legend of La Llorona, or La Leyenda de la Llorona. And it's held every year to coincide with the Day of the Dead. So in a way, she's actually really beloved. But what I'm going to get to later is that the genesis of her story is often related to the Mexica goddess of Cihuacoitl. But I'll get to that in a second. So, some other variations in Guatemala, a common local legend is that in Guatemala City, there lived a woman who had an affair, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a child named Juan de la Cruz, who she drowned so her husband wouldn't know. The woman was condemned to the afterlife to search for her missing children and search for her missing children, and in every place there was a pool of water. And she is known specifically to scream, "Ay, mis hijos, ay, mis hijos," meaning, my babies, my children. And specifically, it is also said that if you can hear her wailing nearby, she's actually far away from you. And if you hear her wailing far away, she's actually quite close. And it is said that if you are to face her, you will be won over to the afterlife and never be seen again. So, in fact, I actually messaged some of my close friends who are Guatemalan, and I asked them about the stories that they had heard. And interestingly enough, they had some really interesting variations on these stories. So, one of my close friends had heard that she had 3 kids, and she drowned them because one day they were crying and crying and crying uncontrollably. And she was so frustrated with their crying that she drowned them and immediately felt bad. And she started crying and started wandering the town and eventually went kind of nuts. And eventually, after she had gone off the wall, she died and her soul was never in peace and she wandered perpetually. And another version that she had heard was similar to the earlier one that I'd mentioned, that she had a rich husband, and in this version, her husband died, and so she couldn't afford to take care of the kids and drowned them. In another version, she was having an affair, and she didn't want her husband to know about her affair, so she ended up killing the kids so that he didn't realize that she had been pregnant with another man's baby. My friend says that she knows people that have actually heard her screams, and apparently it's very bone-chilling and very unsettling. The other thing that she mentioned is that in Guatemala specifically, there are a lot of water fountains, but also pilas. They're like the old-fashioned bath/washing machine. They're often in public areas. I mean, people will have private pilas in their house. They're like these big basins that you fill in with water, in a nutshell. But in public places, they'll have like a series of pilas, and it's often a tributary to a fountain, and they'll have areas basically where you can wash your clothes publicly. And so she's known to hang around these fountains and pilas at night. And so that's often where young teenagers go to make out. So that sounds like a thrilling evening. But, and then the other thing that she mentioned was that you can never see her face, and that her face is always covered with long black hair. But fascinatingly, my other close friend from Guatemala told me some of the stories that she heard growing up, which are a little different. And I've never heard of these, which is really interesting. So my friend was saying that her father would actually tell her stories of La Llorona as a kid. And he said that he would hear La Llorona in the middle of the night screaming with anguish. And he said it was incredibly distressing and really frightening. And it was so distressing that it was contagious. Like the screams would spread distress. And according to her dad, she was a woman with long hair and the face of a horse monster combo, and that people who saw her were carried away by death. I was especially surprised by the horse monster combo, because in my research I didn't see that variation. And that's why I love stories like this. If you have your own version of the story, please email in esotericaandnonsense@gmail.com. So, in Venezuela, there are one of the most famous stories takes place in Los Llanos, which is a plain area with a large sedimentary basin. So it's kind of like a huge plain, if you will, in Venezuela. And this story takes place in the colonial period. And the story goes that a woman died of sorrow after her children were killed, either by herself or, in actually some stories, her children died at the hands of her family. In Venezuela, families traditionally place wooden crosses above their doors to ward off such spirits. So, what I find so interesting about these stories is that they've spread across the continent into South America, and it seems that every country has localized the story. In each of these stories, it takes place in their country, so it has become a tall tale. But what I found so interesting in my research is a lot of people have actually traced the genesis of these stories and related it to a very famous character in Mexican history, and she is known as Doña Marina, or La Malinche. She is a symbol of villainy, and specifically this theme of villainy and infanticide is thought to be connected and borrowed from themes of both Doña Marina or Cihuacoitl, who is the goddess of goddesses. But first with Doña Marina. So Doña Marina, or she's common known as La Malinche, and Malinche or Malinchista refers to a disloyal patriot, especially in Mexico. So basically she's known as like the traitor. She was a Nahua woman. These people were a group of people from Mexico, parts of Central America, and they lived along the Gulf of Mexico. And when she was only 19, she was sold as a slave to the conquistadors by a group of Tabasco natives. Very quickly, she was given to a cousin of Cortés, and very quickly, as they interacted with natives from different areas in Mexico, they noticed that Doña Marina actually had the ability to speak different languages, and that is actually why they gave her the name Doña Marina. She actually had a different name, and there is some debate about what her native name was, but the Spanish named her Doña Marina, Marina being a Spanish name, and Doña Doña is a very high title. It's like the Don. It's a very respectful title in Spanish culture. So essentially, they promoted her to be an interpreter, advisor, and intermediary, and the baby mama of Cortés. So basically, Cortés snatched her right up from his cousin after discovering her impeccable language skills. Like I mentioned, Cortés quickly turned her into a consort, and she actually birthed his first son named Martín, who is considered one of the first mestizos, which is an indigenous and European mixed person. So Doña Marina is considered the mother of modern Mexico, quite literally, because she birthed Cortés's first son. She is associated with treachery, as she aided the Spaniards in their conquest, and she would actually inform the Spaniards of plots against them. There was multiple occasions where certain groups of the native Mexicans, known as the Mexica, there was many times where they had planned to ambush the Spanish and turn against them, and they offered Doña Marina with gifts and peace offerings, hoping that she would help with the rebellion. And time after time again, she would tell on them. It is very sad. I mean, also, I can't imagine what this woman's life must have been like, because she had been sold as a slave to Cortés at 19, and she had already been a slave for a few years. So she had been a slave as a teenager. And then all of a sudden, now you're, the baby mama of Cortés. I don't know. I don't really know exactly what her stance was. I can't speak on exactly what her play was, but I can't imagine being in her position. That sounds like a really tough decision to be in, because these guys have guns. So I don't know. I think it's just really intense. It's really, really, really intense to think about her life. Another really interesting point that I read in some sources was that a lot of native languages to the Americas are very nuanced and not easily translatable into romantic languages, because they use a lot of idioms and they express concepts a little bit more poetically, I guess is the best way I can put it, but it's just not directly translatable. So a lot of sources said that it is, and it's not really known how good of a translator she was. So that actually could have made certain dynamics between the Spanish and natives worse, depending on her ability to translate. So Doña Marina's legacy has been sensationalized, and many myths and stories have stemmed from her, and she is often compared with La Llorona and Las Solderas, who were the women who fought beside the men during the Mexican Revolution. And she is quite controversial. She's considered both the mother of modern Mexico and a symbol of treachery against the native Mexicans, or the native peoples, because they weren't really Mexicans. Now Mexico is an amalgamation of cultures beyond just Spain. People have emigrated there from all over the world. But before the Spanish colonized, the natives there were native to the Americas. And I find this interesting because from what I see from the sources that I've read, Doña Marina never hurt her own children, but symbolically, I guess, there were so many natives that died at the hands of the Spanish. So in a way, if she was the mother of modern Mexico, so many natives died in some people's minds from her hands, or at least from her actions. Very interesting. So the other character that I mentioned that also seemed to be a genesis behind La Llorona is actually rooted in pre-Hispanic lore. The earliest known documentation of La Llorona is actually from a 1550 text that was found in Mexico City. So this actually was this text was not long after Mexico had been colonized by the Spanish. And it is believed that the original story of La Llorona is actually connected and rooted to one of the Aztec creation stories known as the Hungry Woman, who wails constantly crying for food. So essentially the belief is that some of these stories that are rooted in native culture had been told to Spanish people, and then the combination of the two mixed with local history ended up becoming the story of La Llorona. So the story of the, quote, hungry woman, this Aztec, or as I should say, the Mexica creation story, is associated with the goddess Cihuacoitl. And she is the goddess of motherhood. And she is known to have abandoned her child Mishkoitl at a crossroads, and the tradition says that she returns every year to weep for the loss of her son at this crossroads. And there's also a story of Coitlicue. And she is known as Falda de la Serpiente, or serpent skirt, or referred to as Our Lady Mother. She is a deity in the Mexica pantheon, and she is regarded as the Earth Mother goddess. She is represented as an old woman and symbolized the antiquity of earth worship, and she presents one of the most fearsome figures in Aztec culture. So, I know I keep saying Aztec and Mexica. Aztec is technically a European reference to the people who are known as the Mexica people. So forgive me if this is confusing, but the Mexica people are the natives who now populate Mexico and Mexico City. They're in a lot of Western schools referred to as the Aztec people, and I try my best to refer to them as the Mexica people out of respect. Anyway, there was actually a statue of this goddess, Coitlicue, and it was actually uncovered in 1790. And in this statue, she had a severed head replaced by two coral snakes representing flowing blood. And her statue wore a necklace of severed human heads, which reminds me of Kali, and human hearts with a large skull pendant and a skirt of entwined snakes, whilst her hands and feet had large claws, which she used to rub up on human corpses before she ate them. The Mexica people believed that she would devour the human race if the sun ever failed to rise. Fun fact, the statue that they discovered in 1790 was immediately reburied because they found it to be so terrifying. That sounds like some Europeans found it. That's a real woman right there. A real woman should scare the living daylights out of you because you aren't ready. Apparently, this statue also had long black hair hanging down in 13 tresses, which were supposed to be symbolic for the 13 months and 13 heavens of the Mexica religion. So she is also considered the patron of childbirth, and she is associated with warfare, governance, and agriculture, and she's considered to be the female aspect of the primordial god Ometeotl. She was worshipped during a spring ritual and autumnal hunting festival, where an impersonator of the goddess would be sacrificed. Fuck, that's intense. There is a story of her maintaining a shrine. So the goddess Coitlicue was maintaining a shrine on the sacred mountain of Coitepec, which is known as Snake Mountain. So while she was sleeping, a ball of feathers descended from the heavens, and she ended up tucking it into her belt, and by doing so, it impregnated her with the god of war, Huitzilopochtli. So when her other children heard that she had been impregnated in this wild fashion, they were outraged, and they plotted to kill their mother and the unborn child. One of the children felt so bad that they actually warned the unborn child, Huitzilopochtli. He, Huitzilopochtli, emerged fully grown out of his mother and butchered his siblings, symbolizing the daily victory of the sun over the moon and stars. This battle is commemorated at the Templo Mayor in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Very interesting. So here we actually have two stories. One of a child being left at a crossroads and a woman crying for him. And then the other of the child of the mother sacrificing the fellow siblings, which I find very interesting. So at the Templo Mayor, which is the temple I mentioned that commemorates this great battle of the moon or the sun triumphing over the moon and stars, there is a great pyramid there that was once covered with a snake sculpture. So what I find so interesting about this is this concept of a treacherous woman. And in these ancient stories, there actually wasn't a story of a mother killing her children. There was a lost child and then a fight between siblings. But what's interesting is the Doña Marina, or the La Malinche element, because she wasn't. There are depictions of her actually fighting natives. There's not necessarily definitive proof that she actually engaged in combat, but regardless, I think the symbol is very clear. I mean, if she killed someone or not with her hands, she is considered to be partially responsible. She didn't make the machine, but she definitely aided in the progress. So it is really interesting to hear all these stories, because it really does sound like that La Llorona is actually a symbolic story of the mixed lore of both the Spanish culture, but the new Spanish culture, the Spanish culture that was in Mexico, mixing with the ancient culture that pre-existed them. And based on the differences that I heard about in Venezuela, in Guatemala, and in Mexico, I think that this is borrowing themes of this idea of this like primordial mother goddess being a treacherous personality, and then over time that being warped and turned into a villain, because maybe all these stories are true, that maybe there was a woman who was so mad that she married a conquistador, he cheated on her and she killed her kids. Maybe these things happened, like maybe La Llorona is actually like a greater entity. But maybe she is actually Doña Marina. What if Doña Marina actually is so sad of what she did in aiding in the conquistadors' colonization of Mexico, that she herself is actually La Llorona? Who am I to say? I don't know. It really makes me think. And it's such a sad story. One thing I found very interesting also is these stories, especially the story I mentioned of Huitzilopochtli, who is the sun god who emerged from his mother, bears actually similarities to some Greek stories. So it does remind me a little bit of Athena, who comes out of Zeus's head. But there's also a demigoddess known as Lamia, who Hera ends up finding out that Lamia and Zeus are having an affair. Typical. It's like the classic beginning of every Greek myth. Hera ends up killing all of the shared children of Zeus and Lamia. And out of jealousy of losing her own children, Lamia starts killing other women's children. So I actually found that to be a really interesting overlap. There are, I feel like, stories around the world of these like treacherous female archetypes murdering other people's children. And La Llorona has actually been depicted in many films There's an old film from the 30s known as La Llorona. There's theater productions, literature, TV, music, and in the Pixar movie Coco, there is a song played in the movie known as La Llorona. And you're going to be mad at me for saying this, but when I found out that there was a song named La Llorona, I thought of My Sharona, and now all I can hear in my head is My Sharona, the tune of My Sharona with La Llorona. I'm not gonna sing it because it's gonna get stuck in your head forever. What really is going through my head right now is this fascination that human culture has with the treachery of womanhood. And I say this all the time in my private life, but I do think that the might of a woman, the anger of a woman it far surpasses what a man could ever achieve. Like an evil woman is far more evil than a man because, this is my opinion, I think because women feel so tenderly, they also they feel more. And, losing a child or losing a loved one, I feel like a woman it can just play such a deeper game. And so essentially I find it fascinating that not only these ancient cultures have stories of women being war goddesses and symbols of treachery and destruction, but also that like these stories are actually morphing over time and turning into other versions, but they seem to be rooted in these ancient archetypes and ancient tales. The other thing going through my head is I do feel like these stories have been influenced a lot by the Spanish interpretation of the indigenous experience. A lot of these stories talk about a woman murdering her kids because her husband hurt her. And like maybe that did happen, but also from what I know about European history and how Europeans love to retell stories is like it's totally possible that the conquistador killed the kids and she's just really sad about it. Like I think if you're going to be a ghost mourning the loss of your kids, it's totally possible that somebody else killed them. And I did mention there actually was a story where I believe it was in Venezuela where there's actually a version where the woman's family murdered the kids as opposed to her. But I'm just throwing that out there. It's the tall tale of La Llorona has a big Spanish influence over native culture. And I'm wondering the integrity and the truth of these stories because I would believe that there is a ghost, a female ghost wandering through the Americas wailing. That I believe. What I wonder is who she really is and how she became this ghost. And that is something that I don't know if I totally believe the genesis of all these stories, but who am I to say? But that concludes my research on La Llorona. If there was something that I did not cover, if you have interacted with La Llorona, if you know someone that has heard La Llorona, please send me an email at esotericaandnonsense@gmail.com. If you have a subject that you want me to cover, please send me an email. If you have interacted with some kind of ghost, if you've had a spiritual experience, if you grew up in a religion that I've never heard of, if there's anything at all that comes to your mind that you want to share with me, or you just want to say hi, please write in. Especially, I'd like to give another thank you for all my international listeners. Thank you so much for listening. Please send me an email. I would love to know what you think. Blessings. Blessings to everyone. We live in a wild world, and let us not forget that mythology is happening as we speak. What is a myth but reality told from other people's perspectives? Have a beautiful day, and I'll talk to you next week.